Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So, Milos, it's been quite another eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
Yeah, quite a lot this week. So for a start, in the Middle East, US President Trump continued to weigh options for a possible intervention in Iran as he ordered military assets to be deployed in the region. In the United States itself, we've had a few developments that we're tracking. So for a start, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer continued to negotiate a deal that could avert a US government shutdown in exchange for restrictions on immigration enforcement. And at the same time, on foreign policy, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified in Congress on the future of governance for Venezuela. Shifting now to the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese government has removed the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission while authorizing key tech companies to order Nvidia chips. Meanwhile, Russian and Ukrainian officials held talks in Abu Dhabi about ending their conflict, while Russian President Vladimir Putin stated a willingness to meet with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and only provided that he come to Moscow. So a lot to get into.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. So let's start off this week with the Middle East and focus in on the Iranian theater. So in recent podcasts, we've talked about the wide-scale protests that we've been seeing within Iran that were met by a heavy-handed response out of the Iranian regime, as well as some, floating of U.S. potential intervention. That seemed to cool down a little bit, but now we've got that escalating and picking it back up as we're recording on Thursday, January 29th. So Andrew, turning to you here, what can you update us on the U.S.-Iran front?
Yeah, Iran jumped back into the news this week in a very significant way. I'll start with some of the details of what the U.S. actions the U.S. either has already taken or is said to be considering taking on the military side of things. So what we know for sure is that the U.S. has deployed the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is an aircraft carrier, and its strike group towards Iran. A lot of other military assets have been deployed to the region and or that were already present in CENTCOM are postured to conduct military action against Iran if, of course, the president orders the Department of Defense to do so. Now, we've seen this kind of thing before. What really sets this apart is that the president is said very much to be weighing strike options specifically to achieve regime collapse in Iran. So in the past, we've seen limited strikes against Iranian leadership, Qasem Soleimani, or nuclear infrastructure, as in last May, but the U.S. stopped short of going for outright regime change. It is likely, I think very likely, that if the U.S. does strike Iran within the coming days or weeks, that they will in fact go all the way this time for the regime change option. So that would, of course, include strikes against senior leadership, the Supreme Leader himself, the security forces, and nuclear infrastructure. Trump said that he's hoping if he carries out these sorts of attacks that it will spark new protests that will aid his goal of regime change. I'll just remind listeners, Trump threatened during the mass protest movement that the Iranian government very violently suppressed to attack the government and Iran's military in support of the protesters. Of course, that did not happen. So the timing of this news is interesting for a number of reasons. Now, looking at the diplomatic reaction from the region from key U.S. partners, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have informed both the U.S. and Iranian officials that they will not allow their airspace to be used by the U.S. military if Trump, in fact, does order an attack. My understanding is that Mohammed bin Salman personally spoke with the Iranian President Pezeshkian to inform him of this decision. Now, you can ask, I think, interesting questions about any sort of operational impact that might have, or a de-escalation impact that might have on the U.S. decision, as opposed to diplomatic posturing by these countries. But of note, nonetheless, Turkey is currently positioning itself as the primary mediator to keep the possibility even of diplomatic de-escalation alive between the U.S. and Iran. There are a number of reasons why a de-escalation is in the Turkish interest. And then I'll also just remind listeners that Turkey and Iran share a border. So that is something that could have a significant domestic impact on Turkey as well in the case of an actual regime change operation by the United States. The Egyptians are also said to be weighing in personally with calls between their foreign minister and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and, of course, their Iranian counterparts as well. And then one final note of interest on Iran this week, at least for now, is that the European Union has announced that it is designating the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist group. This is directly in response to the IRGC's direct role in the violent suppression of Iran's protest movement over the last few weeks.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, quite a high risk for military escalation out of the U.S. on Iran, as you've noted, Andrew, that we'll be paying very close attention to here. Trump has repeated the diplomatic off-ramp in terms of negotiations with Iran, and particularly over the nuclear program. But yeah, right now the indicators are certainly pointing into a military escalation situation, but that diplomatic front does remain open. Moving on now, staying within the Middle East, some notable developments out of the Gaza theater. So what can you update us there?
So the situation remains very difficult, of course, on the ground in Gaza for the Palestinians. At least 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli fire this week. And of course, this is taking place amongst significant political and diplomatic updates. So this week, the IDF confirmed that the remains of the final Israeli hostage who had been kept in captivity by Hamas inside Gaza have been recovered. A transfer of remains was conducted, and this individual's remains have been returned to Israel and to presumably to his family. This is, of course, a significant deal politically and diplomatically for the Israelis. It's also a significant deal internationally because the transfer of, first, of course, the release of the living hostages, and then the transfer of remains from deceased hostages was a key part of phase 1 of Trump's Gaza peace plan. That is wrapped up now, and at least on paper, the U.S., Israel, Hamas, and a number of other nations can move the deal forward into phase 2, which, as we mentioned before, will focus on a post-Hamas government for the territory, as well as the disarmament of Hamas. As late as a couple hours ago, Hamas reiterated its stance that it is not prepared to disarm. So there remains, of course, a number of significant, not only diplomatic, but potentially military hurdles that the Israelis and potentially the U.S. might have to encounter head-on in order to advance to phase 2 of the ceasefire.
Understood. And rounding out the Middle East, there's been some notable security and diplomatic developments out of Syria. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so in Syria, let's start domestically. For the last 2 weeks, we've been covering the very intense fighting and the on-again, off-again ceasefires between the Syrian army, the Syrian government forces, and the SDF, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, which of course has been for a number of years now the U.S.'s primary counterterrorism force on the ground in Syria. That relationship is now altered significantly. We'll talk about that soon, I have no doubt. But the latest news there is that an initial 96-hour ceasefire has been extended for 15 days beginning on January 26th. So good news there in terms of achieving a permanent ceasefire, which would, of course, necessitate the integration of Kurdish forces into the Syrian army and the Syrian central government. Looking outwards now, Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara recently met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. This is significant for a few reasons. One, this is another milestone, I think it's fair to say, in the career of President al-Shara, given that he led an insurgency against the Assad regime, Russia's primary ally in Syria, for a number of years. Now he has met with Putin personally in Moscow, and the main topic of conversation was the future of Russian forces in Syrian territory. There's been some reports this week that the Russians have evacuated one of their bases that was in Kurdish-held territory that the Syrian army now once again occupies. That leaves basically 2 Russian bases on the coast in Syria, and Moscow, of course, is seeking a negotiation to keep those bases there, given that these bases are, in fact, Russia's only overseas bases outside of the former Soviet Union.
Understood. So lots to pay attention to there in the Middle East, and we'll be paying a particularly close attention to Iran, and we'll be sure to update that in our next episode. Moving on to our next global hotspot of the Americas, and we'll start with the domestic front in the U.S., where we've been seeing a lot of activities in Minnesota on both the security and political front. So Milos, turning back to you here, what can you update us on this issue?
Yeah, so obviously Minnesota did dominate the news this week, starting with last weekend when the Trump administration faced a lot of backlash for its response to the killing of 37-year-old Alex Pretty by a group of federal officers. In the wake of the killing, there was a lot of mixed reactions coming from the administration, at times contradictory even, and that resulted in quite large-scale protests happening across the state. Now, those protests did eventually lead to the agents involved in the killing being placed on leave. There was also the Commander-at-Large, Greg Bovino, who was stationed in Minnesota, but he's now been moved back to his previous post of being a senior commander in California. So on the more strategic level, as it were, it seems that the Trump administration has tried to take a more de-escalatory tone, with President Trump himself stating this week that he was going to try and de-escalate the situation a little bit, with other members of the administration echoing those thoughts. The director of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, Todd Lyons, he has also been summoned to appear in front of a Minnesota judge. Now, in terms of the political repercussions of this, there was initially a fear that there could be another government shutdown as a result of the Democratic Party effectively opposing a new spending bill that would have seen increased funding for ICE as well as the Department of Homeland Security at large, among other government services. However, it seems that in the past couple of days, we've heard from sources close to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer that he is reported to have almost reached a deal with the government that could see a government shutdown averted in exchange for increased restrictions on federal immigration agents, and in particular almost siloing off the allocated budget for the Department of Homeland Security as opposed to all the other government services, effectively allowing the government to continue operating. So we're not quite sure completely what the details of this deal entail, whether or not they're going through, but it seems that at the moment all the signposts are pointing towards, both the government and the Senate wanting to resolve this and to avert that shutdown from happening. So it looks like we'll be keeping an eye on this as well.
Thanks, Milos. And in the meantime, we've been seeing some notable activity out of the U.S. on the Venezuelan theater. So what can you update us on that front, Andrew?
Yeah, so with Venezuela news this week, we'll start in Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He gave them, of course, received a grilling and presented the senators with a briefing on U.S. policy in Venezuela. Nothing necessarily too surprising out of that, but some significant news, some important news that it is giving us an idea of what the ongoing development of U.S. policy in Venezuela is starting to look like post Maduro. So the big news items there are that the U.S. is allowing, keyword, Venezuela to resume the sale of oil that had previously been sanctioned, and then the U.S. will directly oversee the revenue generated from those oil sales to be put back, basically to maintain some level of stability inside Venezuela, the payment of salaries, healthcare, infrastructure upkeep, that sort of thing. And again, the U.S. will conduct audits and directly oversee the use of those funds. To that end, the U.S. also returned a seized sanctioned oil tanker to Venezuelan ports. So we're starting to see what U.S. policy is looking like, but there's still a lot of big questions right now. Specifically, recently released U.S. intelligence reports raised doubts on whether Delcy Rodriguez, the current interim president post-Maduro, will continue to cooperate with the U.S. to the extent that she has so far, or whether she will seek to pivot and make a break, specifically over cooperation between Venezuela with China, Iran, and Russia. The intelligence updates specifically said the U.S. intelligence agencies are doubtful that Rodriguez will, in fact, be willing to break away from those three nations, which, of course, have been key allies of Venezuela under the Maduro regime. And then one final note there, opposition leader Maria Corina Machado is back in the headlines. Not that she has really left, but it's been interesting to see her relationship develop with the Trump administration since the capture of Maduro. And the takeaway this week is that U.S. officials still remain cautious about her returning to Venezuela and trying to run the country due to her perceived lack of relationship with Venezuela's security forces. But she personally has a very good relationship with President Trump. She is very eager to return to Venezuela, and she is absolutely in the running for a long-term replacement in Caracas, depending on which direction Washington seeks to go.
Got it. And just to round out the Americas with a brief update on the Greenland situation. So this past week, we had the Danish Foreign Ministry confirming that negotiations with the U.S. have started over Greenland. This is something that we touched on in our previous episode, particularly over U.S. security concerns in the Arctic. So it seems to have kind of walked past that red line there between the U.S., Denmark, and Greenland. But at the same time, Greenland's prime minister did state that he would not yield to any foreign pressure, while the Danish prime minister stated that the world order of the past 80 years is over. So still seeing some diplomatic ripple effects from those efforts by the Trump administration to acquire Greenland. And this is actually a good segue to our next global hotspot of the Indo-Pacific that also ties in quite a lot of European-related developments. So I'll bring you back in here. Miloš, what can you update us on the trade front, especially as we're looking at ripple effects from that U.S. spat with the Europeans over Greenland?
Yeah, quite right. So the European Union has been forefront and center in the news this week, particularly with regards to the region of the Indo-Pacific. And starting off, the big development from the EU's perspective was the conclusion of negotiations with India for an expanded trade deal. And this is quite a significant update. This is something that both parties have been working on effectively since 2007, so it's been 20 odd years in the making, with lots of starts and stops, with small differences hindering progress. And while we did see that efforts doubled up back in 2022, back when the EU was largely following the Biden administration's footsteps of de-risking away from China, it looks like the Trump administration's threats against Greenland, against the EU with regards to tariffs, has really spurred Brussels to double down on its efforts to de-risk not only from China but also from the US, and that has meant expanding ties with India. And this trade deal could potentially see a doubling of the EU's exports to India by 2032, as well as India reducing tariffs by almost 97% in value on all EU imports. And as a result, this deal has been hailed and I'm quoting here, the mother of all deals by both parties. as it effectively brings together around 2 billion consumers put together and around a quarter of the world's GDP. So quite a substantive effort there. It's still, the final touches still need to be put together, but certainly this is a win for the European Union as well as for India. We did also see similar efforts being made between the EU and Vietnam, with both parties actually upgrading their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is a similar level. It's the highest diplomatic level that Vietnam has, and it currently has with other countries such as the United States and China. So it's effectively elevated the EU as a trading partner. And this is building on a free trade agreement that both parties had signed in 2020. And here as well, the final agreement is still subject to change, but it could expand the relationship significantly to the point of possibly transferring, critical sectors such as defense technology from the EU to Vietnam, as well as expanding cooperation on critical minerals, digital networks, and artificial intelligence. So quite a large development there. But outside of these two countries, we have seen efforts made still by China with regards to Europe, with some developments, including outreach by President Xi to the Finnish Prime Minister, where the Chinese side did express a readiness to work with Finland to uphold the United Nations-centered system, something that Finland really values quite highly. And we've also seen a continuation of this story that we touched on last week, where President Xi also met with the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who, while not a representative of the European Union, is still keen to diversify his trade as well and ensure better economic stability with China and the region. So, quite a lot from the European continent this week.
Right. And in the meantime, we have seen some US-based trade developments with the Indo-Pacific. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned up top, the Chinese government has given its approval to a key number of tech-related companies in China. So this is regarding the H200 microchips from the US company Nvidia. We've talked about this a number of times in previous episodes, with the US giving the approval for the sale, but China seemingly taking its time to gauge whether or not it wants to go ahead with the purchase, namely because it wants to ensure adequate self-reliance on the technological front and not be beholden by imports from the United States, which it deems as risky. However, we've seen that Beijing has given its approval to ByteDance, which is was the owner of the social media app TikTok, as well as Alibaba and Tencent. These three companies have now put an order for 400,000 microchips from Nvidia. And other sources have warned, or rather have said that there are other domestic manufacturers now joining the queue, as it were, and started requesting subsequent approvals from the Chinese government. But shifting away from China, President Trump has also renewed his threat of tariffs on South Korea, who was one of the first countries to have struck a trade deal with the United States. But because of a perceived lack of commitment by the Trump administration by Seoul to deliver on a pledge that it had made during that trade deal, it's looking like President Trump is willing to increase the tariffs by about 10%. And this is specifically concerning a pledge that South Korea had made to invest around $350 billion into the United States, and specifically the tech and shipbuilding sectors. And as a result, we've gotten a statement this week that the finance minister of South Korea said that he would spur lawmakers on to accelerate the investment bill. And this is something that we can readily assume is going to happen quite soon, as we know that South Korea is keen to stabilize its economy, as are many countries in the region. But we've seen this with outreach on the economic front with other countries such as China as well. So we'll likely hear developments on this front, whether or not South Korea goes ahead with this, and whether the US delivers or imposes the tariffs that it's threatened in the coming weeks.
Gotcha. And just rounding out the Indo-Pacific, some notable military-related news out of China. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, we got some news that took a lot of people by surprise this week. So President Xi Jinping, who is the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the Department of Defense, as it were, of China, he came out and removed the vice chairman from his position, as well as another senior general, the chief of staff of the commission, and both of them have been put under investigation after being accused of not only taking bribes, so corruption, but also leaking secrets on China's nuclear arsenal to the United States. And this is something that the Taiwanese government has come out and said it is closely monitoring, because effectively this leaves a significant vacuum within the strategic decision-making capabilities of China. Now, I should mention that the vice chairman of the commission, who just got removed, he's one of the few people in China's military who actually has personal combat experience. He fought on the Chinese side against Vietnam back in the 1970s. So removing him leaves quite a vacuum, not only from the decision-making side, but also on what could be brought to the table in terms of experience. So the general consensus seems to be that as a result, it's unlikely that any significant moves against Taiwan are going to be made in the short to medium term, so presumably until the end of 2026. But we've heard from Xi Jinping himself that he wants his armed forces to be at least capable and ready to take Taiwan by force, or to move against Taiwan by force in 2027. So, that is still on the table. We haven't heard anything to the contrary. So definitely something that Taiwan and the rest of the world is keeping a close eye on.
Got it. And let's move on to our final global hotspot of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So turning back to you here, Andrew, what can you update us on the diplomatic front over the conflict?
So since we left off last week, there was a trilateral talk hosted in Abu Dhabi between, of course, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the United States. Now, all three of those nations have described that series of talks as, quote, constructive. We've been, of course, following these diplomatic efforts in detail for some time now, and I do believe that this is the first time that, again, Ukraine, Russia, and the United States have all spoken of a set of talks in positive terms. Another interesting detail there, Ukraine's foreign minister said that, quote, there has been a qualitative change in the composition of Russia's negotiation team, essentially saying that this is a group of people that they can conduct serious diplomacy with, as opposed to the lead negotiators in past efforts. The other significant note from Abu Dhabi is that there will be a second round of talks beginning February 1st. On that end, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that, again, Zelenskyy was not at the talks, but commenting after the talks had concluded, he said that security guarantees, a proposal of security guarantees from Ukraine is, quote, 100% ready for signing by the United States. The major holdup, of course, and Zelenskyy also recognized this, is the issue of territorial control over Donbass, the entirety of the Donbass, but really specifically the 20% of the territory that Russia currently does not occupy, as well as the operational control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Again, just a number of interesting statements from senior leaders this week. Officials at different levels have said that progress has been made over those issues. And again, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the same thing. All three parties seem optimistic, of course, within the context of a very difficult situation going into this second round of talks in Abu Dhabi. So we will definitely keep a very close eye on that and report back next week. Senior Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov has said that Putin is willing to meet directly with Zelenskyy on the condition that such a meeting take place in Moscow.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.